The exposure triangle is a lot like the Bermuda Triangle for a lot of new photographers. It's this mysterious thing that people throw around and talk about, but it's really not really understood. Don't know what it is, don't understand how it works, but it's absolutely critical to understand it if you want to start creating photographs instead of just taking them. So in this video, I'm going to reveal all the mysteries of the exposure triangle in a way that beginners and amateurs that are just getting started getting their camera off of that auto mode and into manual mode, I'll explain it in a way that's visual, that you'll be able to understand right away. So let's get started. The exposure triangle: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Those are the three things you can control with your camera. Those three legs make up your exposure triangle. And what I've got set up here is going to allow us to visually demonstrate, and I can show you exactly how changing one affects the others because they're all interconnected. You can't change one of those settings on your camera without one of the others being affected. So we have spice bottles that have word on it, writing on it. We have a book here in the back that's a little bit larger that has a logo and more writing on it. And then we have a fan that's rotating on its lowest setting, its lowest speed, that's going to help us visualize and be able to see what happens when we adjust that shutter speed. Before we do that, we need to just have some basic definitions down. ISO is your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. So just like the gain knob on a stereo, you can turn it up or you can turn it down. You can do the same with ISO. So if you want to make your camera sensor more sensitive to light, so to speak, you can turn your ISO to a higher number. If you want it less sensitive, you can turn it down. You might be thinking at first, why not just have the ISO set so that it's sensitive to light all the time? That sounds better. But there's a problem. Just like on a stereo, if you turn the volume too high and it starts to distort and get pretty ugly sounding, the same thing is kind of going to happen with your photographs if that ISO gets too high. What it's going to do, it's going to introduce what we call digital noise. And that noise is ugly, the noise looks bad, and it degrades your photograph. As it gets higher and higher, it gets worse and worse. So if you want the best quality, you want to keep your ISO as low as you can. Aperture. The aperture is the opening in your lens that allows light to pass through. So you can have a large aperture, which would have a large opening that would put a lot of light in, or you can have a very small aperture that lets very little light in. The difference between the two is if the aperture is large, your depth of field, which means the amount of your photograph that's in focus, is going to be smaller. It's going to be a lot less. If you've ever seen a portrait, a professional portrait done where the person's face is very in focus, but everything behind them is kind of this creamy blur, and you can't really tell what it is, it's just blurred out. That is a very shallow depth of field, and that's done with a very large aperture. If you want everything in focus, like if you're doing landscape photography, which is what I do mainly, then you're going to want usually to use a very small aperture. That small aperture that you create by setting your aperture to a number like f16, a large number. I know it's counterintuitive, but that's the way it works. So as you set that aperture to a small hole, to a smaller opening, you're going to have a much deeper depth of field. So as a landscape photographer, I'm usually shooting at f11, f16 sometimes. If I'm shooting portraits and I'm doing people and I want that very, very creamy out of focus background, then I am going to be using an aperture like 2.8 or 1.4, which is a very large aperture, and it's going to let a lot of light in. Shutter speed. Shutter speed is measured in seconds or fractions of seconds. The longer your shutter is open, the more light comes in. The shorter that it is open, if it's open for a very short amount of time, then obviously less light gets in. Less light means a darker photograph. More light means a brighter photograph. But there's also an added thing where your shutter speed controls movement. If you want to show motion and blur, like in a waterfall or maybe something waving in the wind, a flag, then you would have a slightly slower shutter speed that would allow that to blur. If you wanted to freeze motion, like you had a football player running down a field catching a ball, and you wanted to freeze that action, then you would use a much faster shutter speed in order to freeze it so that it wouldn't be blurry. So we're going to start with an aperture of 2.8, which is a very large aperture. It's the largest for this lens. It's a 16-35. So that large aperture is going to let the most amount of light in, but it's going to give us a very shallow depth of field, meaning that the depth of field is not going to be very great. Things are going to fall out of focus very, very, very quickly. So if you look at the spice bottle in the very front, I'm going to focus on it. I'll take the shot. And we're still at f2.8. And we are going to put the focus point back on the book as far away as we can get. And then we'll take the shot. Here are the images in Photoshop. I've layered those two together. The very first one you'll notice is where I focused on the spice bottle right here in the front. Perfectly sharp, but you notice that the depth of field falls off the further away from the focus point that we set. It falls off very, very quickly. You can't even make out any text back here or even back here on the book. It's very, very soft. It's out of focus. So if we look at where I moved the focus point to the very, very back of the image and I put it on the book, notice here that this is perfectly sharp. All of this is, you can even read the label on, it's a little soft back here, but you can still read the spice bottle with the pepper in it. But up here in the very front, it's absolutely out of focus. It's blurred. You can't read it at all. So our depth of field is being demonstrated visually very, very easily here with the 2.8 very, very open aperture. So let's take a look at what happens when we change that depth of field from 2.8 to f16. I'm not going to go through all of them. It'll just take too much time, just to show you how much that depth of field is going to increase. Because remember, 2.8 is a very open aperture. f16 is a very small or closed aperture. It's a very, very small hole. So let's take a look at what f16 does to our focus. So this is shot at f16, and I focused the first photograph, just like before, on the very front spice bottle, and this is absolutely perfectly sharp. It looks fantastic. Notice though that we can still read everything here in the back. We can even read this pepper bottle. We can even read the text back here. This is very, very sharp. Everything looks really, really good. It's not perfectly sharp all the way front to back, and that's a topic for a different video, but it's the depth of field from where I focused to the back is a lot deeper. It's a lot better. It's a lot more. So this is where I focused back here. This is perfectly sharp. This is perfectly sharp. This looks great. This looks great. And this looks pretty good as well. Depth of field is greater when you have a smaller aperture. And I will just toggle these two on and off so you can see this is focused here in the front. So this is where it's focused, is here. And then this one is where it's focused in the back. Front, back. So there's a slight difference, but overall you get the idea. The depth of field is greater at f16 than it is at f2.8. You notice in the two examples that I just gave you between f2.8 and f16 that the exposure looked the same. But remember I said every time you make an adjustment, you have to compensate with one or the other legs of the exposure triangle in order to maintain a proper exposure. So by going from 2.8 to f16, something happens. So let's look at that. We're at f2.8, and I'm going to adjust the aperture. We're going to step down or close the aperture, and we're going to go to f8. What's happening to our image? Why is it getting darker? It's getting darker because we are using a smaller aperture, and by using a smaller aperture, we're letting less light into the camera. And we haven't adjusted our ISO or our shutter speed to compensate for shutting down that aperture. So how are we going to adjust the shutter speed in order to get a proper exposure? We're going to have, since it's dark, we're going to have to use a longer shutter speed to allow more light into the camera. So we'll dial that in until we get a proper exposure. The next part of the exposure triangle we're going to talk about is shutter speed. So the fan sitting on the table is spinning, and let's say that we wanted to freeze that motion. We're going to have to use a very fast shutter speed in order for that to happen. So let's take a look at shutter speed and how it affects our exposure. As you can see, the fan is spinning, and right now my shutter speed has been very, very long in order to get a proper exposure. I wasn't really concerned about it. But if I want to freeze that motion in that fan, something's going to happen to my image as I make it faster, because I want to freeze that motion. It's going to be open for a very short amount of time, and it's not going to let a lot of light in, and that's going to make my image darker. My image is dark because I've increased my shutter speed. So that shutter's open for a smaller amount of time, doesn't let as much light in. So I need to compensate with one of the other legs of the exposure triangle. And I can pick either one, knowing that both have drawbacks or effects that happen. So if I adjust my aperture, as we've just learned, if I open that aperture up to make it brighter, it's going to decrease my depth of field. But I don't want that. I need everything sharp from front to back. So if I can't adjust that aperture in order to bring more light in, and I've got to have a fast shutter speed, then the only other leg of my exposure triangle left to adjust is my ISO. I have my shutter speed set to 1,000th of a second because I believe that's a good number to freeze that motion in the fan. So let's watch what happens as my ISO gets higher and higher. I go to 80,000. Which is extremely high. I would never ever shoot at that high of an ISO. It's just ridiculously noisy. But we're going to ramp it all the way up to the maximum of my Sony a7R IV, 102,800 ISO. So as you can see, a shutter speed of 1,000th of a second freezes those fan blades pretty good. And that's what I was going for, right? That's the objective. And I needed a deep depth of field. So f16, 1,000th of a second. And then I had to ramp that ISO up to get a good exposure to those insane levels. So this is the image at 102,400 ISO. And as you can see, it's total garbage. It's totally unusable. It's just nonsense. These camera manufacturers come up with these insane high ISO numbers, and you go, wow, that sounds amazing. I'm going to buy that camera because it's got the ISO goes really high. It's useless. It's propaganda. It's garbage. The highest ISO that I like to use under specific circumstances is somewhere around 32,000 or maybe 64,000. And that's pushing it way beyond my comfort zone. Anything above that is why, in my opinion, is kind of like a why bother. The cameras just aren't that good yet to be able to produce usable results at those extreme ISOs. Exposure triangle. Hopefully it's a little clearer than it was at the beginning of this video. ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, how they all work together so that you can create a photo with the look that you want. The depth of field, the blur or the sharpness, and to mitigate that noise by keeping your ISO as low as you possibly can. That's the first thing I teach my students, or I go out on a workshop, is keep your ISO as low as you can, because the other two, your aperture and your shutter speed, are really where the creative control comes in. And you use that ISO just to balance out your exposure so that you get the look that you want. That's going to wrap up this week's video. I hope you liked it. I hope you got something out of it, learned something. If you did, I sure would appreciate a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to share it with your friends on social media so that you can help my channel grow. I do workshops. I've got stuff on my website. Check that out at www.jamesparkerphoto.com. And I do Zoom, Skype lessons for post-processing as well. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.